Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I'm facilitator of the online Adaptation Communities of Practice, and those are run by us here at OPR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this very short introduction, we will have the main presentation, and that will go for about 30 to 35 minutes. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have some time left over for any questions that you might have for the presenters. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. And before we get going, I just have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted. Reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions or feedback, etc. during the webinar. So to ask a question during the Q&A session, all you're going to have to do is dial *6, and that will unmute your line. But please do keep your lines muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenters during the question and answer period. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can use this chat area to type out your message, or you can actually click on my name and send me a private message, and I can try to help you as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the Community of Practice website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line who may not be familiar with what the FACoP is, so I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are either working in forestry or those who are simply interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It includes features such as news articles, events, an online library, discussion forums, and much, much more. So it's actually free to join. So if anybody on the line today is interested in learning more about the FACoP, you can just click on the link in the chat box for more information to register. So with that being said, we're very excited to have Harry Nelson and Ngaio Hotte on the line with us today to talk about economic instruments for adaptation to climate change and forestry. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenters, Harry is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia, specializing in forest policy and economics. His research interests include institutional arrangements for forestry management in Canada, the effect of market and non-market factors on forest sector firms, along with exploring the changing roles of government, industries, and communities and how we manage our forests and public lands. Harry is also a co-lead on the Kamloops Future Forest Project. So Ngaio is a resource economist and facilitator with the Department of Forest Resources Management and Faculty of Forestry at BC, where her research focuses on the economics of sustainable resource management. Her previous projects have included exploring economic incentives for adaptation to climate change and forestry, reviewing economic benefits of urban forestry, and identifying economic impacts of climate change on forestry in BC. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the two of you for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. We appreciate it very much. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to Harry.
Thank you, Annette, and good afternoon, good morning to wherever you are today, and thanks for the opportunity to present this project. This project, which wrapped up in December, was funded by Natural Resources Canada, and it was produced through the Adaptation platform. And in it, we explored how we might use economic instruments to help us better adapt to climate change in forestry. We'll see we focus on BC, but more broadly across Canada and more generally. Now, before we get into what an economic instrument is, let's just set the stage really quickly. Even though this will be familiar for many of you, we've already seen evidence of a warming and a drying climate, or just a changing climate in many parts of the country, in BC in particular. So those two figures to the left show you changes in precipitation over the last 25 years. The middle figure shows you changes in winter temperature getting warmer. And not too surprisingly, some of the outcomes we see are that picture on the right. Trees that are dead, dines, could be drought, could be pests, could be disease. And the challenge then is how do we deal with the changing climate and the risks that it poses to the forest resources, the values we derive from those forests. To give you some grounding, and you'll see as we go through this, this project is meant to tackle both kind of from a theoretical and practical perspective. This graph is taken from a survey that was carried out by the Association of BC Forest Professionals in the fall of 2013 that looked to kind of assess climate awareness across all those forest professionals that are working across the different sectors, for government, as consultants, for industry, and others. And this one just shows you the top of mind concerns for these forest professionals. And you'll see second down at 83% of the respondents identified that increased levels of natural disturbance and mortality were something that they either were concerned about or were already seeing. And that was followed by increased levels of disturbance and mortality around wildfire. So keep this in mind, please, as we kind of move through the rest of the project description. When we started to formulate the project, and Ngaio will explain in more detail how the project was structured and how it worked, we ended up focusing, and she'll explain how we arrived at those, on some specific risks that we examined and application of these things. And the first was wildfire risk. The picture on the left shows you kind of fire risk in the province over the past summer, where you can see the highlighted areas in red and orange, showing you how much the province was under increased fire threat. And we know that these maps are only we're getting more red and we're getting more orange for longer periods of time as we roll forward through the summer. And the photo on the right, a fire from West Kelowna, which to date still is one of the most expensive fires we've had. Not this fire necessarily, but some of the big fires we've had in the past 10 years. And the risk of losses that come from these kind of fires. The other risk that was spoken about in the climate change survey, we've already touched on, which is kind of increased mortality and disturbance. These are pictures of pine plantation stands up in northwestern British Columbia and the effect of Dothystroma, leaf blight on them, or needle blight. And these are just kind of illustrative. Could have picked Northwest BC, we could have picked plantations through the southern interior and elsewhere, where we're worried about stands that aren't developing or already showing signs of failure and loss. And the question of, what we should be doing about it. So what are economic instruments? This is a fairly kind of new area, certainly in terms of the application for adaptation. The idea of economic instruments kind of comes from sort of the area of trying to think about how we could better achieve environmental objectives. So much of when we start to go through there is kind of drawn from examples you'll see from there. More generally, people kind of characterize an economic instrument as something that's different from the traditional kind of command and control or regulatory approach. So one can think that if you're trying to achieve an environmental objective, reduce pollution, you might just mandate companies have to adopt the technology or limit how much they commit. An economic instrument might find another way to try and achieve the same environmental objective. And one of the benefits that's been demonstrated in the field of kind of managing pollution, things like that, is that these instruments can be both more flexible, they can be more cost effective, and they can also be somewhat more adaptable, that they can respond to kind of changing circumstances, which may be more difficult when you're adopting regulatory approaches. Now in that, it's not to say that you might not need to make regulatory changes to support the use of these economic instruments. So, cannot completely pull those two apart. One of the other benefits of economic instruments is that depending on the type of instrument you may use, you may be able to generate revenues, and that those then can be used, in this case, to support adaptation activities, since that's usually a concern around how you might be able to finance doing something new or different. And finally, one of the things I think that we try to highlight in some of the case studies is you can look at how economic instruments might be used for planning. which is an integral component of resource management. It's often highlighted as a key step in proactive adaptation, but oftentimes some of the gaps are you might plan, but then how do you actually move forward towards implementation? Instruments offer a way to kind of contribute both to the planning and as a way to move forward. So in more detail, what might an economic instrument look like? Well, sort of four categories about how we can think about these. One of the ways is to try and incorporate the true cost into the prices. You can see inputs or outputs. Of kind of the things that we use or that influence kind of our production process or our decision making. This can be through taxes or subsidies or the use of markets. Example would be carbon price. We have BC under discussion, or a carbon tax under discussion elsewhere. The use of cap and trade markets, or the use of water markets for water pricing to try and reflect perhaps the real scarcity value of water rather than kind of administered system. Second, an economic instrument could offer a subtle social cue or change the default options we have around choices. These are kind of considered behavioral instruments. So again, you're not going to mandate that the decision maker, or an actor has to do something, but you may change the choice in front of them in a way that is more likely to lead to a better outcome. The best example, the most well-known here, are kind of making automatic contributions to pension plans the default choice rather than having people try to opt in. So that automatic opt-in and with a choice to opt out has been shown to lead to higher savings rates. The third way, we know that providing information, because information sometimes can be a barrier towards more efficient use, towards decision making, can be a way of improving outcomes. And so in this case, examples might range from providing things like information on energy efficiency to consumers, so they can better evaluate the attributes of something they're buying rather than just looking at the price or size of a washing machine or dryer. And for an example that's closer to home, something like Fire Smart, that's meant to provide information to homeowners about what they can do to reduce fire risk for their property. And then finally, and we'll touch on this at the end, there might be more fundamental changes. One could actually go and look at how you might actually change kind of sort of the rights and responsibilities around a system. And by that, we know that ownership or how risk is born has a powerful influence on the action tenants that will bear. And so changing rules around liability or risk can influence actions and outcomes. And an example here would be from something that many people are familiar with, the fact that oftentimes you might have a deductible for your home insurance or for car insurance, which is meant to, in some ways, encourage you to take action so that, if something does happen, you bear some of the cost, presumably removing some of the likelihood that if you didn't have to, you really wouldn't care, how fast you drove, wherever you went. Now, let Ngaio speak to the next slide.
So this project began in October of 2013 and extended through the end of last year, September 2014. And the idea was to identify economic instruments that could support adaptation within forestry in British Columbia specifically, but with applications to across Canada. So the project was split into two phases. The first phase, which took place between October and February of 2014, was sort of a literature scan and some interviews to scope out the research, the analysis. So because economic instruments and the application of economic instruments is so new in adaptation, we looked at broadly where economic instruments are in use across forestry, agriculture, and land use to sort of inform what the options might be for applications to adaptation. So once that analysis was, or that review was complete, we presented that phase one report we distributed it to about 50 or so practitioners and held a workshop in February of 2014 to identify what are the needs for adaptation, what actions are required, what are the most important risks, and then to identify the potential role of economic instruments to create incentives for the actions that mitigate those risks. And then to select case studies. So, which instruments were the workshop participants most interested in learning more about? And so those priorities informed the case studies we selected for the second phase of the project. So Harry will talk a little bit more about the three case studies that were chosen. But there was three researchers that focused on each of those case studies, and once again involved more, a deeper literature review, more focused interviews with practitioners that have expertise in these fields of these case studies, and then another phase 2 report. And you note there is an error on the slide. There was phase 2 report case studies was in October. And so again, the report, the information was distributed to those people who had been engaged in the first workshop, plus some more additional people who had expertise in the case study areas. And then we invited those people to come back together again for the second workshop in November to share the case study research results, sort of ground truth the findings, and identify applications of this research. So make sure that the results of our research were valid and could be operational. And then in December, we pulled all the documentation together, so the phase 1 and 2 reports and the outputs from the workshop into the final project report in December. So one thing that was really important in this project was the participatory approach that we used. So we focused on, we had an advisory team, expert practitioners, and 2 workshops that we used to engage with practitioners and experts and to ensure that our research was grounded and would be relevant to decision makers, policy makers. So our advisory team consisted of 7 representatives from the provincial government, so from the Ministry of Environment, Climate Action Secretariat, and from the BC Ministry of Forest, Land, and Natural Resource Operations, Purdu, shorthand as FLNRO. And so representatives from different departments within those agencies. They helped to guide our research and to ensure that it was relevant and that provided a lot of important input and helped us to pull together the most important participants for these workshops. We also engaged on an ongoing basis with about 5 expert practitioners from industry and associations who were able to give us really operational input and steer our research and offer advice. And again, so the 2 workshops involved about 40 participants each from various levels of government and from industry. So with these groups of people, we selected and prioritized case studies, received input during the research, and received feedback on the final research results that were incorporated into the final.
So I'm going to speak briefly now about the 3 case studies. Now, you can imagine there's a lot of material presented in each of these. We easily could have had a webinar on each one of these. So I'm going to kind of touch on the highlights. And at the end, I'll emphasize that all these case studies and the final reports freely available to anybody that would like to have them. The first case study looked at fire risk. And it looked at fire risk from the perspective of the wildland-urban interface, which is clearly as we highlighted earlier, one of both the priorities of FLNRO and emerging from experience we see elsewhere around other similar jurisdictions as something that poses potential for catastrophic losses if we're not careful. Second, spoke to the issue of maladaptation. To what extent are the trees that we're planting going to be suited for this kind of the future climate, and what we might do perhaps to mitigate that risk. So it looked at something that in BC we're calling climate-based seed transfer, which is a type of assisted migration where you're affecting in some ways, your planting strategy. And the third was around wildfire risk on the landscape, and looked at tools or instruments to support collaborative planning and management. And now I'll speak to the first two case studies in a bit more detail. So the first case study was carried out by Paul Kovacs at the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction in Ontario. And Paul looked at what local government and homeowners, or what local governments, I should say, sorry, were doing to try and manage the wildland urban interface. So that's communities that are living kind of in the forest with the forest around it. So this is sort of kind of an inside looking out at what tools they have to try and address those kind of wildfire risks. And the main one that Paul examined was the use of development permits, which are ways in which the regulatory tool that underlies it, but they're ways in which local governments shape how and where development takes place that can affect the cost of development. And this can be used in a way to better plan or support plan efforts, better shape what actually development might take place. In the absence of it, where we don't have that, we might be putting developments in fire-prone areas and increasing risk rather than trying to mitigate it. And when Paul was looking at this, he was also looking at supporting efforts and other things that local governments can do around adopting bylaws that might govern, roofs, things that have to do about protecting kind of or reducing the fire risk to dwelling well in the area. So not only where development takes place, but what kind of, what those building constructions look like. So what were the findings? Paul did a broad scan all across Canada, also looked down in the States as well, and found that some communities have been very proactive about adopting standards to reduce fire risk, including using development permits, including introducing bylaws changes, and that this did look like a promising area to kind of help local government and homeowners better reduce this fire, this potential from increased fire risk in the future. Same time, there were clear concerns that, depending on how this was structured, if development permits were seen as an obligation that was downloaded on the local government, that would probably be ineffective, that it would only in some way increase cost perhaps, and less likelihood that local governments would want to take that approach. The second case study, looking at climate-based seed transfer, was carried out by Colin Mahoney, who's a registered professional forester and also a PhD candidate at UBC Faculty of Forestry. And Colin focused in specifically looking at climate-based seed transfer and the economic incentives and disincentives around how that might be used, examining it both from a government and a private or licensee perspective, how they might approach, implementing climate-based seed transfer, and what kind of informational requirements could be used to help support climate-based seed transfer, both in an individual decision-making and a more strategic decision. He looked at how, in terms of the instruments, and this is going back to the idea of the type of informational instrument as an economic instrument, how that might be incorporated into the timber supply review, which is the process we use in BC to determine allowable cut levels, and from a individual kind of licensee or decision-making agent's perspective, how you might approach this in terms of how risk is born and how that influences these incentives. Clear message that emerged from this was that there's a very strong, there's sort of split for different incentives between the two parties here. In British Columbia, the current system, the private party bears the short-term risk, in other words, they have an obligation around what kind of treaties are established within a certain time frame. At that point, that obligation then kind of passes to the government, and in that there's a kind of a disconnect there then from those longer-term risks into the decision-making of the party that's actually doing planting. And so, among other things, it was clear that rethinking that risk and a new risk-sharing framework would be required to support efforts to introduce or implement climate-based seed transfer, assisted migration more generally.
So just wanted to know, we're just having a little bit of trouble with connectivity with the presentation, but we're going to try and through as best we can. So the third case study then was the one that I worked on, looking at collaborative wildfire planning and management. And so the objective of this case study was to look at ways that longer-term collaborative stakeholder approaches could be used to address the issue of wildfire. And so Harry mentioned in the first case study that the development permit case study was looking at sort of an inside-out approach to dealing with wildfire. This is sort of an outside-in, so how wildfire could be mitigated, risk could be mitigated in the landscape, but with an eye to impact on communities and infrastructure and all these sorts of things. What came up for us early in this case study was the importance of that there was two parts to it. There was a role for economic instruments to support the collaborative piece of planning and management, but also to finance and support, provide funding support for planning and action across the land base. So it was very much, we looked at both of those aspects. So our policy focus was, we looked at where leading edge collaboration programs to support collaboration have been implemented in British Columbia and in Victoria, Australia, as well as in the USA, where all three of these jurisdictions are dealing with increased risk of severe fires and losses under climate change, but also, significant involvement of public involvement in management of forest land compared to private forest land. So what we found in this case study was that wildfire is an interesting example where collaboration can be, there's a strong incentive to collaborate, or there can be, because there are clear risks to both licensees, so forestry companies, and government, and clear benefits of collaboration, also across resources and sectors. So because the risk and the impacts are known and characterized and clear, there's incentive for that everyone would be better off if there was collective solutions to reducing wildfire risk. And also that this type of collaborative framework could then, once in place for wildfire, could provide a basis to address other risks, other climate-related risks like pests. So I realize this has kind of been a brief overview of the case studies. We can talk a bit more about them in case you have questions about it. So coming out of each of these case studies, there were some more specific ideas as to ways that one could try and help further progress around each of these risks. But here we want to speak to some common issues that we found across these case studies. And I think one of the interesting kind of observations for us was that it turned out that resources were not what was necessarily limiting action. Instead, or a lack of resources, instead it was more the fact that there needed to be a prioritization around risk and around taking action. And this sort of leads into the second kind of observation, which is that right now, as these risks are changing and kind of broadly distributed across sectors or perceived differently by different parties, it highlights the importance of coming up with better understanding of how these risks are now impacting people. And that in turn highlights distributional impacts that really are the concern. People start talking about these
what's going to happen. But again, I think based on our preliminary observations, we think there are ways economic instruments can be used to address those distributional impacts. So I would highlight that it's not just simply sometimes whether or not it's going to be an impact on my cost. Some of these may be around these changes in risk and what that means. And so that highlights again the importance of knowing how you evaluate that. We'll see in the next slide. And then finally, I think what's encouraging was that many of the discussions, there were lots of ideas out there. People had to try and select some. We couldn't look at all the ones that were raised. And a general agreement that these were seen, many of these were seen as feasible ways of moving forward in terms of enhancing action. I don't think anybody saw something as a particular silver bullet, and sometimes it was part of a bundle of other actions. But these are clearly something that we can do that's going to improve the chances of taking action. Same time, there are some key gaps. One of the things, one of the benefits of the participatory approach was the expertise that we could draw on for everybody within the system, really grounded good decision making and understanding of how people think about the actions they're taking, whether it's around harvesting or planting or preparing strategic or operational plans. But at the same time, one of the drawbacks sometimes is, tends to lead you to kind of makes it more difficult to think outside the box. So I think one of the things, the useful way to go forward would be starting to think about where we want to be trying to think out of that box. That said, even within it, there's some valuable things that we can do now. One of it is clearly valuing the benefits of risk reduction are going to be an important part moving forward. It's going to help identify the benefits of collaboration, it's going to identify why the different agents may want to do something, and right now we're still sort of limited in the tools that we have that. All the people that worked on the project, Robin Hooper, Paul Kovacs, and Colin Mahoney that couldn't be with us, Ngaio, and would welcome your attention and your questions.
Okay, great. So thanks so much, Harry. So we now have lots of time left for any questions. So if you have any questions or comments, now's the time to ask. Again, if you'd like to use the chat box, please feel free to go ahead and type out your question, and I can read it out loud for everyone. If you're on the conference call line with us and prefer to ask a question over the phone, all you have to do is hit *6 and that line. So I don't see anybody typing just yet, so I'm just going to go to the conference call line. So if there's anybody that has a question, just hit *6 and go right ahead. Okay, so if there are no questions, I actually have a question for you guys, if that's okay. So were there any lessons learned from the participatory approach that you used? So I don't know, anything interesting that came out of it?
So something that came up for us was we really were pleased to find how enthusiastic the participants were to participate. I mean, having people who are sort of unfamiliar with one another, who work in different sectors, and there was some sort of relationship building that needed to happen, but people really seemed to enjoy the chance to collaborate. And so that was a good experience. That people sort of found it fun, and I think that's important. If collaboration is sort of proposed as an important part of adaptation and building these connections, but I think that it needs to be an enjoyable experience in order to sustain it over the longer term.
I would echo what Ngaio said, and I guess I'd like to kind of point out too that Ngaio had many roles in this project, and one of it was she designed the workshops and collaboration, and that was clearly a critical element in making this a successful project. And so I would just say that if you think about collaboration, be aware that there's a lot that can be done to support successful collaboration. It's just not simply a matter of calling a bunch of people together in a room and just saying, hey, we're going to talk about adaptation. So, yeah, I was really surprised by the power of it.
Perfect. All right, thank you. So I'm just wondering, I don't see anybody else typing questions, but will the case studies and the reports, are they available online now, or will they be online and available?
So I think we will have them, we'll put them on, I will share it with you, Annette.
Sure.
I guess we could distribute it to the library, actually. There's no reason why you guys can't post them.
Okay, perfect.
I will double check with Natural Resources Canada, but I think, I don't see any issue why. I mean, the whole point of this was to share it broadly.
Disseminate information, yeah, absolutely. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I don't see anybody else typing, so this is last call for questions or comments. Last call also on the conference call line, we'll skip there. So if anybody's on the line, just hit *6 and you can ask a question. Okay. Well, I'll give you a couple more seconds. Last and final call. Okay, so Dave Spittlehouse has a question on the chat. So what can we implement in the near future? Right.
So I have one. It was really interesting to us that when we started talking about collaborative planning and management for wildfire, that numbers started coming out about, what would this cost? What would it cost to, do more? And once there was actually discussion, people realized that, well, that's actually not that much money. That's very doable. And so there was talk of from folks during the workshop about sort of going back and seeing what could be done to, allocate that amount of funding. But yeah, once people got excited about it, about the collaborative planning and management for wildfire idea, then the funding question actually seems to be much less of an issue. So that was something that my sense was that it was very doable in the near future.
Yeah, and I think the context there, and again, for those of you not in BC, maybe a bit more too much detail, but the idea was there were places in the province where it was seen as it could be integrated with some existing processes done as a pilot. And there's this kind of long history in BC of where people are concerned about overly ambitious kind of this attempt to try and integrated planning across a broad landscape. This was seen as more feasible by tackling this kind of well-identified risk and using that as a way then to prioritize and move forward. And so coming out of the discussions there, I think there was some momentum within the ministry, and that's one of the kind of ongoing discussions we're having as to how we can support that. Another idea that came up from which we didn't touch on in the description of the case study, were some ideas coming out of the U.S. about how you can deal with issues around low-value biomass and such, sort of switching from a timber-only focus to trying to achieve a certain kind of objective on the landscape. And that's an idea that we're actually working with some of the industry partners in trying to test the feasibility of that up in the interior right now. The idea is called stewardship contracts, for those of you that may be familiar with it. And then finally, the CBST policy is in the process of being developed, and I think we're hoping that we can contribute more to that. That work's still ongoing.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Okay, any last questions from the conference call line? Or any questions from the conference call line?
So, Annette?
Yep.
If I can, I just realized part of this is we thank them in the report, but I would also like to take the opportunity that within this project, we had I just can't speak enough for the engagement of all the advisory board and others, but two in particular, Paul Knowles and Kathy Hopkins at Slinro, were extremely supportive and from a personal perspective, taking time once a month, sit with us and go through and make sure that, we're staying on track was, helped contribute in large part to the success of this project as well. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge their involvement as well.
Perfect. Sounds great. Okay. Well, I don't see any other people writing here for questions. So are you guys okay if they contact you via email? If anybody has any further questions for you about the case studies or the reports?
Happy to.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap things up here. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the FACoP webinar. We enjoyed it. Obviously, a very big thank you goes out to you, Harry and Ngaio, for your time and effort and for a great and informative presentation. Any final comments before we log off here from you guys?
No, as always, we would welcome feedback. Always looking for new ideas and suggestions. And if for any of you, if you're aware of something interesting or innovative you think happening or wherever you are, please feel free to share it with us. And we look forward to kind of sharing kind of this ongoing research with you as we continue to work on it.
Perfect. Okay, great. And then, so I'll be posting once you hear back from NRCan. We can also post that the reports to the community practice, so stay tuned for that as well. Okay, so great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining, and